130 years ago, in another world, the little A1X Terrier represented state-of-the-art locomotive design. The London, Brighton and South Coast Railway used them on commuter trains, and it was said that if you could drive and fire a terrier, then you could drive and fire anything. Terriers were gradually banished to the outposts of the Southern Railway system, and for the next 60 years, almost unnoticed, they hung on, too useful to scrap.
They're 1870 technology, aren't they? Made out of wrought iron, to obviously a very old design, but they stood the test of time.
The Isle of Wight was one of their refuges. The island was always a dumping ground for clapped-out rolling stock from the mainland. The A1Xs gave sterling service here until the end of the Second World War, when they were repatriated to the mainland. There are still a few Isle of Wight engine men who can remember them here, like Ken West, who returned to work on the Terriers in the preservation era.
Just lay the water out the main res. Once you've been stood all night from water accumulated, that's how your brakes work freer.
Ken joined the railway as a lad at Newport Shed and got to know the Terriers well.
That's the pump. West needs a pump. That's what works the brakes. Both these locomotives I fired far back as 1946. I fired them up what was known as the Merston event in the West Branch. And that was very picturesque and a pretty little job. Engine one out and two coaches, what they call push and pull.
Sometimes, in emergency, the Terriers worked the heavy holiday trains, and Ken can remember the day this very engine ran out of coal.
We booked on a turn of duty at Newport Shed, and the only locomotive they had, funny enough, was this one, number 8. Now we had to take that one with 5 coaches to do 4 trips of K's and 3 trips of ride. And we run out of coal about 2 on. But she done the job, and she's pulling 5 of them. You're talking about 130 ton empty.
But the Terriers weren't popular, particularly with firemen. A day on an A1X was a backbreaker. They were just too small, and the firehole door was just too low, so the fireman would be either bent double or banging his head.
The Terriers have a very low-pitched boiler. The firebox door is on a level with your toe caps, and it's about the size of a large letterbox. You can never see your fire unless you turn yourself into a hairpin and stand doubled up. The cab roof isn't high enough for a man of my height. The injectors are halfway up the side of the engine, and to work them you have to lean out to see the overflow, while you're trying to put the injector on with the controls in the cab.
The Terriers may have been a nightmare to fire, but firemen don't have a vote at head office, where the bosses identified plenty of uses for a Terrier.
Well, I think really it's just that they were so useful. Some branch lines, like the Hayling Island line, of course had a weight limit, and the locomotives were needed to be small enough to operate the train service. But they were used in all sorts of areas, for shunting and station pilots, and it even had one in Brighton Works that was the pilot there for years. Just useful, nice little engines.
More than anywhere else, Hayling Island, between Chichester and Portsmouth, was the Terrier's salvation. A branch line left the main line at Havant. 2 coach trains, headed by a tiny Terrier, would set out to cross to Hayling Island from the mainland. There was a long bridge across Langstone Harbour, and nothing else available was small enough to cross it, so the Terriers had the place to themselves. But it wasn't an easy day's work for the engineman from Fratton Shed in Portsmouth, and these images from the early 60s show the grimy reality of everyday life with steam. A quick wash and a cuppa were life's little pleasures. 40 years later, the surviving engines are good as new, but even in the gentler world of preservation, the Terriers still have plenty of enemies among engine men.
Well, I personally think Stepney, the little A1X, the children's favourite. It's a nasty machine. That you've really got to work hard on a Terrier. If you can fire and drive a Terrier well, nothing else will be a problem to you.
It's strange to think that the London and Brighton Railway relied on these finicky little machines to rush city gents to work in an age when people were less tolerant about getting to the office late.
These engines are actually built for London commuter traffic in the 1870s, and the reason they're called Terriers is they're actually quite fast in between station stops. The coaches at the time being a lot of small wooden bodied vehicles. I'll now put the engine into reverse gear, and that will enable me to go backwards. I'll make the brake again, and this time I'll have to open the regulator because we're going uphill, so we need steam, and off we go. Just comes to a stop again. I'm applying the brake, hopefully for a gentle stop. And I put it into mid gear. That's like neutral in the car.
The oldest of the survivors, Fenchurch, has been remodelled at the Bluebell Railway into its original A1 form, with distinctive pipework between the tanks and the smoke box.
To represent the originality of the class when they were A1s, it was necessary to change the smoke box and a lot of the pipework and details that are on the engine. The chimney's new, and it's made, I'm sure you'll agree, a very attractive little locomotive. The thinking behind it really is to show the public and show railway enthusiasts how these engines used to look many, many years ago.
At the end of the 19th century, when the London, Brighton and South Coast Railway had its Terrier fleet in service, a fleet that helped to cement the reputation of Stroudley as a designer, the London and Southeastern Railway had its own brand new tank engine and an equally celebrated designer, Drummond. This is the M7 tank, one of the largest of the 044 wheel arrangement. It was another of those survivors, engines which became railway antiques simply because they were too good to throw away. Like the Terriers before them, the M7s found their way into the backwaters of the Southern Railway.
Their two main jobs were either push-pull work on branches, which they were fitted with the Brighton type of compressed air push-pull gear, and they would propel one or two coaches up and down a branch. The other job, for which quite a number of them were used, particularly in London, was for empty coaching stock workings from Waterloo out to Clapham Junction.
They'll pull 13 coaches with no problem. They'll even accelerate in mid-gear pulling 13 coaches, which takes a bit of strength.
We used to pull trains from Bournemouth West station up into the sidings, and we used to even work empty stock trains with them. And you might have a 12-coach train with an M7, and they used to handle it.
They were capable of a gallop. Commuters were getting home to Guildford faster 100 years ago than they are now. Sometimes a country train would take passengers and goods.
Well, certainly further west in Devon and Cornwall, there were the branch train was really the only form of communication, so they would have to carry not only passengers but parcels as well, milk as well, and the milk would come up from collecting points in churns, in wagons like the Van B, to a point where they would all be transferred onto a train that would then go up to Vauxhall. Normally in Hampshire and Dorset, you would see them with 2 and perhaps 3 coaches, push-pull, passenger only, where the freight business didn't exist.
At Bournemouth, Mike Standhaft worked in the push and pull link with M7s.
It was a good link to be in, because the fireman spent most of his time on the footplate on his own. So the fireman was actually driving the loco and handling the engine for most of the time. That's why it was one of the senior links.
At the Swanage Railway, Mike helps to look after the sole surviving operational M7. 30053 goes down in history as the luckiest survivor from the steam era. They'd actually started cutting it up when an American bought it over the phone. And it only came back from the States when the Americans realised they weren't allowed to run an engine with no leading wheels. But what are these engines like to drive and fire? Well, the answer is that they're roomy and powerful. But if the fireman can't keep the pressure up, then Drummond engines will bite.
It can catch you out very quickly, definitely, yeah, and it catches people out. And suddenly the fireman will notice that he's losing his steam and he can't imagine why, and he's looking in there to see what he's done wrong, and he's just thinks to himself, what have I done? Another trip, everything's all right. So if you do, just let the fire go thin in a certain area, the steam will fall back very quickly.
The M7 waits at Norden, the park and ride northern terminus of the Swanage Railway. Mike Standhaft is at the controls.
We're only on the first valve of the regulator, and the lever's up at about 30%. I try to give her the first valve fully open and then keep the lever up above 35, 30%, 20. And when I'm on the level, I pull her right up inside 20 to 15. And that cuts her right off, and then she works lovely.
The Swanage Railway in the shadow of Corfe Castle is one of the most scenic routes in Britain, and it's also a working railway, helping to take road traffic out of the Purbeck Hills. It's the perfect setting for an M7. The engine's owners are pleased to keep alive this tribute to the designer.
Drummond was a very clever man, although, you know, when you look at a simple locomotive like that, and it is simple, you don't realise the subtlety that's there. You only really find out about that when you're using it or when you're restoring it. But it's a wonderful machine.
They were very comfortable engines to ride on. They're a lot more comfortable than the modern standard tanks to ride on. Why they were like that, I don't know, and I think a lot of it was to do with the fact they were inside cylinders, and an inside cylinder engine always rides better than an outside cylinder engine.
Mike Standhaft believes the M7 in its day was the equivalent of the final versions of British tank engines, and the Swanage is in a good position to judge, for it operates 2 of the British Railways standard tanks.
That engine is the modern version of the M7. That was built for suburban trains, and the M7 was built for the same job in its day. So virtually, the 2 engines, the standard and the M7, were designed in their day for the same job.
The third main constituent of what became the Southern Railway was the Southeastern and Chatham Railway, who'd inherited machines like this and rebuilt them to their own liking. The 060 tender engine was to become one of the mainstays of 20th century British steam. This version is the O-class, rebuilt as the O1.
Well, the locomotive was built at Ashford Locomotive Works by the Southeastern Railway, and as you can see, it looks quite old because it was built in 1896. It was subsequently rebuilt by the same company in 1908 with a bigger boiler in, as you see it now, and was class O1. Originally it was class O, and it's the only type of this engine really left, apart from our C-class, which you've seen here, which is very much from the same stable, and make a lovely pair to look at.
A chap I know who was a driver at Bournemouth, he worked in 01 on a fast passenger train from Waterloo to Bournemouth, and he said it went beautifully. So they've got a lot of ability, those 01s. They're terribly primitive though. They're a bit like a Great Western engine. When you're trying to oil them up, there's places you just cannot reach. There's no steps to climb up at the front of the engine, so you have to climb up at the back and walk along to the front to do half of the oiling. The axle boxes can't be oiled simply by filling an oil box with pipes running to the axle box. You have to dive in head first and find the axle box and poke oil into it itself, and there's all sorts of strange things like that. But that aside, they're very nice engines. They're very comfortable to drive, easy to fire. I think from the firing point of view, there's only one thing wrong with them, the tender. It's got a limited water capacity, and because they had to poke in as much water as they could, they've made the water container a square box. The coal lies on top of the square box, so there's no depth of coal. The bit that you shovel from the space that you shovel from carries about a ton of coal at the most. Once you've used that, you've got the problem of getting the coal off the shelf into that hole. In BR days, it was simple. You climbed up there and shoveled it forward while you were running. But they wouldn't allow you to do that now.
Here the O1 is double-heading with another Southeastern design, the C-class. And at a casual glance, the 2 machines look identical, though the C-class is a more modern design altogether, a Wainwright creation from Ashford Works at the beginning of the century, and now turned out again in all the original glory of the Southeastern.
There were 109 of those C-classes built. They were, heavy goods vehicles or heavy goods locos of the day, very soundly engineered and a little bit more modern in the sense they had better valve gears and rather more robustly constructed. And the boilers were a good deal bigger as well. I mean, they used to not only run goods trains, but the sort of hot picker specials and excursions like that.
What we found was that they were extremely strong, very, very strong, but their brakes were no good. Remember, we were working freight trains, not passenger trains. Now, when you're working a freight train, the only brakes you've got are the engine's brakes and the brake van at the back. If you have 600 tons on with a C-class, although you can pull 600 tons, you've got a very hard job to stop 600 tons. The handbrake on a C was useless, so we were used as firemen to walking over to the handbrake and checking the train down. When you tried to do that with a C, nothing happened. Then when the driver put the brake on, nothing happened again, because the arrangement of the brakes on a C is such that there's hardly any braking effect. So although we liked them for their pulling abilities, we didn't much care for them in comparison with Brighton engines for their stopping abilities.
In recent years, Clive Groome, the leading steam teacher in Britain, has passed on his skills to hundreds of enthusiasts. His footplate days and ways courses have turned many volunteers into drivers and firemen.
Well, you can gather more speed than that. It'll build up slowly anyway.
Firing the engine is the hardest bit, as much an art form as a science.
The trick is to work on a fire so that flame comes through the whole of the surface cleanly and brightly, without smoke, without any thin patches where cold air will get through. And you work the fire in accordance to what's going to happen in the next 10 minutes. Because what you do doesn't really have effect for 10 minutes. So if you've got a bank approaching and you know the engine's going to be worked hard, you have to thicken the fire up before the bank in such a way that the extra coal doesn't cool the fire down, and in such a way that when the blast comes on the fire, there's sufficient fuel on the fire bed to withstand the blast and it doesn't draw holes in the fire.
Among Clive's most accomplished pupils are his daughters, and today Elizabeth is on hand to show just how easy firing can be.
Right, now the fire, as you see, is quite a nice depth, shape and colour, and it requires only a small sprinkling of coal around the compass points of it, as it were. And what we do, we take 3 places across the front, 3 places up the sides and 3 places across the back, and Elizabeth will direct her shovels to those places. Okay, so Elizabeth, if you just throw a little around that box just to finish the fire off. Now there's not a lot of coal on the shovel, that's why it's easy work. And with small amounts of coal, you keep the heat of the fire to its maximum intensity. And that is the art of firing. Small quantities, frequently thrown, and to exactly the right place.
Trains were getting heavier at the end of the 19th century, and this Brighton pairing illustrates how designers responded by building larger locomotives. The engine behind the Terrier is one of the E4 class introduced in 1897. The various E-classes with their 062 wheel arrangement became an important part of the Brighton fleet.
The E4s, E4Xs, E5s, E5Xs, they're lovely tank engines. I didn't think a lot of them when I worked on them at Norwood, but I've subsequently come to realise they are a very nice engine.
It was the E4s that helped to kick the Terriers off suburban work. Eventually the E4s themselves would join their little cousins in branch line service, but in 1898, when Birch Grove was built, it was a front-line machine.
They were really the modern commuter train, or I say modern, you know, the turn of the century commuter train engine. I'm not sure there was as many commuters in those days, but there's a very intensive service. And our Southeastern Railway H-class train came across Birch Grove, used to run that type of traffic into London Bridge and Cannon Street and so on. They were the equivalent to our electric train in a way.
They're smooth running, they've got a radial axle box under the cab. The cab is enclosed, the controls are nicely positioned, and the engines drive and fire extremely well.
After a wash and brush up, Birchgrove prepares for duty on the Bluebell on a misty morning. Its innards reveal ornate Victorian origins, and the mess it leaves behind reveals the equally Victorian drudgery that always went with steam locomotion, though on the footplate there's a relatively comfortable working environment.
Right away for guard. Okay, mate. Steam coming out the front is from drain cocks, which just allow the surplus water to come out. Once the thing's underway and it's dry at the chimney, we can shut them up. And we've got the stance. And then once it's underway again, we can pull the reverser up. And turn the blower off, which just keeps the fire from coming back in the cab when the regulator's not open.
Firing an E4 was a skilled job, mainly because the firehole door resembles an oval letterbox. There isn't much room for a shovel.
You've got to be a clever fireman because you've got to fire with a flat shovel through a very small door. Although the door is high up and you can see the fire, it's not a door that you can actually put a shovel in with coal on it. You have to leave the coal to go through on its own and not attempt to put the shovel in. And that's an art. But they respond very, very well to good firing and driving.
In 1909, the Southeastern Chatham Railway introduced its P-class tank engine, which was always overshadowed by its venerable Brighton equivalent, the A1X Terrier.
They were built sort of 30 years on from the little A1X class. I think I'm right in saying 1910 the bulk of them were built. So they're slightly more modern, although of a similar size. Designed really to do the same job, although people say they weren't quite as successful as the A1X, particularly the Brighton fans.
This rare triple header shows the P-class to scale, sandwiched between the two Brown engines from Brighton. The P-class and the Terrier weigh about the same, 28 tonnes, which is half the weight of Birchgrove. Most enginemen would have preferred a P-class machine to the unpopular Terrier.
I don't find them nice at all, Terriers. But the P-class has everything working as an engine should have. The firebox door is at the right height, the cab roof is high enough to stand in, the injectors have decent screw-in and screw-out water controls. Mind you, it was built something like 1900, so there's 25 years of development gone into steam engines.
The P-class tank is high and thin, which suited the taller crews, and there's a lip to the roof which offered a vague promise of protection from the elements. But where it really scored over the Terrier was in ease of use. The driver has handy controls, not only the little brake lever, but also easy to reach blower and injectors, and a small steam-operated reversing lever instead of the more cumbersome long lever found on most small engines like the Terrier.
The Terrier has got a stick release reverser. You must shut it up, pull it back and open up. That's how you do it. This one, you just go like that. Done.
And which of them do you prefer, Ken, and why?
I've got no preference at all. I'd like to get on that one, I like to get on this one.
Adhesion weight is a limiting factor on both types, as is about to be demonstrated on the Kent and East Sussex Railway. P-class engines were commonly used on shunting and light goods work, and this one has a modest mixture of goods wagons in tow. Most of the journey is flat across the low-lying Romney Marsh, whose waterways glint among the passing fields. But there are hills ahead. What the driver doesn't want is a dead stand on a 1 in 40 incline, especially on a wet and greasy rail. The driver usually wins the argument with gravity, and the little P-class, still with steam to spare, makes it comfortably to the summit at Tenterden Town Station. They were, as the Fat Controller would have said, really useful little engines. The Isle of Wight Railway is so deeply buried in the countryside that you're never quite sure where the train will appear from. The gem among the fleet is Calbourne, the surviving Adams tank engine of the O2 type that once ruled this little railway kingdom. Everything about the Isle of Wight Railway was old, though these Victorian coaches didn't last quite as long as the engines in British Railways service. Up until the swinging 60s, the O2s were still taking holidaymakers on that last leg of their journey to the seaside. They were good engines, extremely smooth riding, with a spacious cab and a coal bunker specially extended for the job. And they had the ability to haul several hundred passengers when the need arose.
Well, the low summertime, you not the small coaches you've got over there now. You'd have the four-wheel bogies. I beg your pardon, not the four-wheel bogies, the bigger ones. The load of them will be 6 of them up the Ventnor Road, and you're talking about 5, 6, possibly 700 people will be travelling in those trains, and by golly, you know you had them. The Wight would vary about 150, 160 ton empty. So you just imagine what Wight you had armed behind when you had those trains were filled up. You just, you know, it's a lot of Wight.
It was the O2s that displaced Terriers from the Isle of Wight, but happily both types are now back on the island. The big difference from the crew's point of view is that Calbourne has a much roomier cab. It's positively palatial compared to a Terrier, and now The fireman could actually see what he was doing. The chief engineer on the railway is full of praise for the O2 and its smaller stablemate.
We're lucky, really, that we've got two types of engine which are absolutely ideal for preservation, whereby the Terriers are a little bit ancient and small for some of our traffic. The O2 is perfectly adequate for this line. The bunker and cab are adequately proportioned to the rest of the engine. There's a good sized footplate there, very well designed. Adam certainly looked after his footplate crew. The Terriers left the island just after the war, so there are not so many people remember those, but the O2 is what anybody that's seen Island Steam remembers.
Today, with Ken West at the helm, we can sample the delights of the Adams tank engine, whose 044 wheel arrangement gave it a Rolls-Royce ride, typical of the London and Southeastern tank engines. The two elderly enginemen keep their locomotive lolloping along with such skill that they hardly seem to be working, and neither does the engine. With a relatively small band of volunteers, the Isle of Wight Steam Railway has performed miracles of restoration. The four-wheel Victorian coaches, for instance, had to be recovered from being used as beach huts or chicken sheds. Between the wars, 80-ton engines like this S15 or its big-wheeled cousin, the King Arthur, were in frontline service on the Southern.
I'm pulling her up so I can get a bit more steam in the steam chest. No, leads her out again now. That's better.
Engine men like Ron Davis found the new 10-wheeled Urey and Maunsell engines to be jacks of all trades. The footplate crew found themselves working like one-armed paper hangers to keep on top of the engines.
Start putting the water in now. Excuse me, Ron, may I get to the water valve? That's the water valve. And this is the steam valve. Right, open the steam. Top of the bank. Set the water. Water now being injected into the boiler. And we'll shut off. Open the door. Keep the smoke down, cool the fire a bit. If we're really lucky, it won't blow off.
The S15 was the principal heavy load hauler.
Mainly the S15 is the Southern Region freight engine. The sort of works we did were the heavy freights with them. They weren't a speed engine. You wouldn't have a fully fitted freight with it normally. It was always heavy freight. We used to bring them out of Southampton docks, out of Beavers Park. That's down at Southampton. I don't know if you know that. That's at Southampton. We used to work heavy freights out of there. And you'd take them mostly up to Feltham, where they were shunted out for all different parts of the UK.
Lord Nelson class engines had the glamorous job of hauling the express boat trains, but the real revenue earner, as usual, was freight. "50 years ago it was a different world, with railways still the prime mover of Britain's goods traffic. The S15s were in daily use at Southampton docks, sharing the heaviest of duties with the new 9F engines. The big British Rail Standard classes had very little advantage over the S15 except for being more comfortable.
They were just more modern. I mean, an S15 would go up there quite as well on less boiler pressure. They would pull 1,000 tons with no problem whatsoever. Strong brakes, strong engine. They needed all the regulator, so the regulator was commonly right over to the fireman side of the footplate. They could be worked at 25% cut-off and they would hammer along like an old cart horse. They used them on passenger trains in high days in the summer and they were quite alarming. The cab roof at 75 miles an hour will be wanging up and down above the driver's and fireman's head as it flexes. The weights on the driving wheels were huge and gave a huge hammer blow. The ride was fairly firm. The coal in the tender would be shuffling forward as the tender hammered into the back of the cab with the reciprocation of the cylinders. So the tender would be banging into the cab. The coal would be shuffling forwards as it does under those conditions. The backdraft from your forward flight would cause a vacuum in the cab which would draw into the cab small coal and dust from the tender. If you tried to water it down, the water turned round and poured over you with the vacuum. When you arrived at the station, the sudden silence of it all for your half a minute in the station was a blessed relief. But I still liked them. I still liked them because they were such game old buggers. They would steam, they would really steam beautifully.
S15s first appeared on the London and Southeastern Railway, like this engine, designed by Urey. But after railway grouping, Maunsell continued to build them for the Southern Railway with slightly higher boiler pressure, and they were good enough to survive until the mid-60s. Today, number 506 is on duty on the Mid-Hants Railway, where it enjoys an energetic retirement, for the railway, known as the Hampshire Alps back in steam days, is a switchback ride. Even the big S15 will work hard on days when there are half a dozen coaches to be taken between Alton and Alresford.
Because of the banks that we've got. You know, we get the 1 in 60 banks, and if you put 6 behind 506, 506 is working like she would have done as a freight engine almost.
Right, we have the signal, we have a green flag from the guard, we have a whistle. Listen to the steam, and we start to move. We've got 4 carriages today, which is well within the capability of this engine. It could do 6 or 7 quite easily, but the load today only dictates 4 coaches. We're on a gradient of approximately 1 in 3,000 at the moment, so it's not too bad for the engine. About a quarter of a mile around the corner, it will then steepen up to 1 in 80.
If you had an S15 that ran quiet, you thought there was something wrong. You'd go and book it and say, look, what's wrong with this engine? It's not rattling. They always clanged and banged, but they're a freight engine. You know, that's they're being worked so hard all the time. The S15s were identical in many respects to the King Arthurs, the key difference being an extra foot in the diameter of the Arthur's driving wheels. All of them had the 460 wheel arrangement, but the Southern Railway had also acquired a fleet of 260 or mogul engines, as typified by the U-class machine. And in recent years, a U-class engine found its way back onto the mainline. 31625 is about to set sail from Guildford to London. And all 3 of the footplate crew are men who drove the U's back in steam days. Guildford was once the home shed of this very engine, and the crew are about to make sure the town knows she's home.
Bringing back the lever to about 45 feet.
With its right-hand drive, bell pair firebox and tapered boiler, the U is distinctly similar to Great Western engines, but then there was a strong GWR influence on the Southern. And the firing methods are the same as a Western mogul: fill up the back corners and then let the front of the grate look after itself. This technique, as perfected by Eastleigh engineman John Smith, would have made perfect sense to a Swindon man.
All those Maunsell engines, the U's, the N's, the N1s, U1s, W's, they were all very, very nice engines. The three-cylinder versions were like Rolls-Royces. The 2-cylinder versions were strong and fairly simple, but everything was in the right place. The cab of a U is a lovely environment. The reverser is easy to use, completely balanced, much better than any BR standard reverser, much better. The regulator is easy to handle, it's balanced. Of course, it's basically a Great Western engine with improvements. So all the good things about a Great Western engine are there, and all the bad things are not.
I was at Bricklayers Arms, and we had those type of engines down there. Actually there was U's, U1s, N's, M1s, basically the Maunsell type engine. They were a nice engine. The N class was a smaller wheel. That one they used to use like 1625 as more passenger service, because it's got a 6-foot driving wheel. But it got along, it does get along, and for its age it does very well. That type of engine does like caning, it's not an engine you nurse along. Otherwise you'll come to a stand. You do actually drive those engines, they're nice.
We use them occasionally on passenger trains. We used the small wheel versions, the ends on goods trains. They would pull 1,000 tons. They were easy to fire to. The firebox was about 8 feet long. You maintained a sloping fire, high at the back, shallow down the front, and they were a treat to use. I'm very fond of those engines. I think they look good too.
This particular machine, beautifully set up by the Midhants Railway, was steaming so well at 60 miles an hour on the main line that they were struggling to keep her from blowing off. As so often in the suburbs, the fireman has a problem. A good fire is needed for the sharp accelerations, but with so many signals and permanent way checks, he needs a crystal ball to stop the valves lifting after each series of unpredictable slacks. Just as John Smith has got his fire right, suddenly they don't need all that steam. The hiss is from the safety valves.
Oh yeah, she's very free steaming, very free. In fact, she can be a bit of a nuisance at times, you know, because you have to control her. Especially a nice clean fire as well. So you don't need the dampers wide open. And as you may have noticed with John Smith, it's, you know, blowing off all the time, like, you know, that's steam from the valves, by the way.
With 9 carriages in tow, the U-Class engine storms through the hilly North Downs. These engines were popular, not least because of those easy-to-use controls, and also their smooth riding. The driver, Malcolm Hall, is able to stand comfortably while checking his timings.
Regulator on.
The ideal is 15 mile an hour, so it gives the fireman time to get his steam back.
Journey's end, and for the driver a chance to sum up the capabilities of this Maunsell masterpiece from the 1920s.
She's a good steaming engine, quite a powerful engine for a Class 4. As good as the 76 standards, which came later. They were Class 4 as well. They were not all like that. I think it's where they've rebuilt the loco in very good order, and the valves timing is correct, which is very important, and that gives her that extra bit of power.
The search for more power, particularly during the Second World War, brought new designs to the Southern. Mr. Bulleid had taken over. His flat-sided Pacifics, the Spam cans, were a new and hair-raising development for Southern engine men.
The drivers that took over those Bulleids, when they were built in the 40s, had been driving King Arthurs mostly. There was only 16 Nelsons. And those King Arthurs were as heavy as lead and practically never slipped whatever you did to them. And then they were suddenly faced with this rather complex machine, full of gauges, with a steam reverser that frightened them to death, 280 pounds pressure, and a regulator that had no real first valve to it. Okay, now most regulators have quite a large first valve which you get the engine going under before you hit the second valve. On a Merchant Navy or a West Country, it's a very quickly opened regulator. And those men weren't used to that. And of course they slipped and slid all over the place when they first came out.
Initially, the Merchant Navy engines were streamlined so they could fit through the carriage washing plants. But the metal straitjacket was soon removed to reveal a top-link machine whose reputation only grew over the years.
The Bulleids were always a welcome sight on a train because they could do anything. Some of them made harder work of it than others. It was, with an old Bulleid, an unconverted one, always a hot day's work in the summer, a very hot day's work. There was very little fresh air to be had in the cab, very little forward vision. You'd be amazed how little you can see from the driver's window on a Bulleid. Especially if the wind was blowing from the fireman's side, either from the front or behind the engine. You could see nothing because the steam came straight out the chimney and plopped down in front of the driver's window and stayed there. And you drove into a mass of steam all the time. You had the regulator open if you had a southwesterly or northwesterly wind blowing on the way to Bournemouth or Salisbury. The way the drivers knew the road enabled them to drive in those conditions unbelievably. They would know instinctively where the next signal was going to be, and they would shut the regulator, open the blower to blow the smoke out of the way, look at the signal, see it, and then open the regulator again and see nothing.
Rodney Tizard progressed from cleaning boy to merchant navy driver. He was an Eastleigh man who watched the conversion of this class at Eastleigh Works. He spent his whole career at this one shed, one of the busiest in Britain in its heyday, but now largely silent.
It was packed, solid with engines, 17 roads. Basically every road was full in the mornings, and as the day went on, of course the shed became quieter, smoky, dirty, but a good ambience, a good amount of laughter, a good lot of fun, because we were cleaner lads then. Health and safety today would have, you know, they would have gone mad. We used to scamper up on top of the boilers, hobnail boots, relied on the studs to keep our feet on the handrails while you cleaned off the top of the boiler, and in general, just grease monkeys.
Rodney typifies a generation of gentlemanly drivers whose quiet humour and modesty disguised an inner toughness, for they were responsible for rushing several hundred tons of train through the countryside.
It's always a thrill. The weather can be a great asset or a great inhibitor. You can do it when the rain is sheeting down sideways, so that you feel, on a Bulleid especially, you feel as though you're in a steam-powered submarine, almost operating underwater when the rain is really lashing down. You can't see a thing through the window because it's starred with water, and there's no wipers. You have to, if necessary, poke your head out and get a good load of needles in your face to catch a signal. Your ability to keep a check on where you are on the line at any moment is very, very important. You've got to look across to the fireman and sort of inquiringly look at him if he can see a signal on a bend, and you can't. He will have stopped firing long enough to accustomize his eyes to the darkness so that he can look out, catch that signal, give you the thumbs up, no shouting or screaming or anything like that, just a quiet thumbs up. You trust him, you carry on at the same speed.
Nowadays, a steam express is a celebrity event, but in the British Railways era they were grimy machines, hardly worth a glance as they passed. Clive Groome remembers the excitement and terror of trips like these.
The first trip you do on your own, you think, God, everything I decide to do is up to me, and if I do it wrong, it's down to me. And that really puts things in perspective. And the first train I drove to Southampton, where I was relieved by another crew, I remember getting to Southampton, stopping right for water, which wasn't an easy thing to do, and very often I've not stopped right for water. I won't claim to be the most expert stopper for water columns. And I stopped right, they took over, I handed the engine over, my mate and I went out to the pub to have a drink, and when I picked up my pint, my hand was shaking. I couldn't hold the bloody glass still for nerves. It was such a stressful thing to run that first train without a driver on the other side of the footplate to make sure I was doing it right.
Since then, Clive Groome has driven A4s, Duchesses and Kings. But for sheer, steam-raising, unburstable performance, he'd always take a Bulleid out of choice. Not that all of Bulleid's machines had film star looks. This is the ultimate ugly duckling, the Q1. It was introduced in 1942 when nothing mattered except economy and power.
Well, it was built during the war when there was a severe restriction on materials and the use of materials. And it's called a Class Q1 because it was based on Bulleid's predecessor, who designed a class of engine Class Q. And all the motion in between the frames is standard with the Q class. It's merely the sheeting and the boiler that was markedly different.
Its power-to-weight ratio was without equal, which meant that if the crews could stop it slipping, they had one hell of an engine to work with.
The Q1 was a massive improvement on the Q. The Q was under Bulleid. The Q1 had a wonderful boiler on it, quite a large firebox. It was extremely strong. They would fly along on a passenger train, a little bit rough, skip all over the place. It looked rougher than it was, possibly because you had no framing hiding the wheels from the driver's view. So looking down on 6 wheels, which were skittering along from side to side on the rough patches, with the side rods whizzing up and down as though they might fly off any minute, was a bit alarming.
I would say a moderately good engine to drive, but there are problems with it being light in weight. It tends to be what we would call light on its feet. It'll pick the wheels up very easily if you're not careful. If you open the regulator too quickly and too fast, you'll slip. But that apart, it's a very strong engine and it's reasonably well set out.
The crews noticed that they were going home blacker than usual. The Q1 was a dirty machine to work on.
Yes, it tends to be because it has a large blast pipe to even the draw on the fire. Instead of having a single blast pipe, there's a multiple jet blast pipe, which softens the blast, which means that the ashes which get drawn through the fire tubes come down on the footplate rather than on the passengers in the train.
There's just one survivor, which belongs to the National Railway Museum and spent a while on the Bluebell Railway. Occasionally it wore a golden arrow headboard to pull Pullman dining trains, a very different role for an engine that pushed the 060 wheel arrangement about as far as it can go.
They were as powerful as they could make it for the weight of the locomotive, so anything that was really superfluous to the loco was jettisoned. And it's all power and boiler, isn't it? There's very little frills on the thing. And of course they were very, very successful engines, but I don't think anybody would call them good looking, would they?
In 1942, when Britain stood alone in Europe, the Americans turned up with some engines for us. It was almost like the cavalry riding over the hill to the rescue. The USA class, which vied with the Q1s for sheer ugliness, were products of the Vulcan Iron Works. They'd arrived at Southampton docks, and that's where they stayed until 1967. Nowadays they've strayed to places like the Kent and East Sussex Railway, where the chubby little tank engines have encountered hills for the first time in their life. including a bank that pitches to steeper than 1 in 40.
This is the wet cutting, which is quite a steep part of the line. This is about 1 in 39. Little occupation crossing there. And as we come out of the cutting and round the corner, the gradient will ease, and she should then start to pick up speed. We've got a full pot of water, got plenty of steam. My fireman's working quite hard to maintain the pressure, as it is quite a climb up here. Bit of a wheel slip there. Open and close the regulator and just be very gentle, finger trip control, just try and keep her moving.
Along the coast at Brighton, Bulleid was working on another streamlined design, the West Country and Battle of Britain class, the most numerous 462 class ever built in Britain, and they replicated all the glories and the faults of the merchant navies. Bournemouth engineman Stan Symes was one of the lucky firemen presented with a brand new Bulleid after the war.
From a driving point of view, they're powerful, very responsive, very comfortable to drive, got a good cab, plenty of room. The steaming qualities are excellent. There's never any fear of being short of steam with them. And they had a character of their own.
Part of that character was the ability to slip. Southern engine men soon learned the Bulleid way of juggling with the regulator every time they started a train.
When you started away, you whack the regulator open to make the engine jump forward. Once it had jumped forward, you shut the regulator and let the pressure drop until it dropped to about 60, and then you opened it again between 60 and 80 and shut it again, and as long as you kept it floating between 60 and 80, it would pull a train away with not a trace of a slip. And as your speed increased, you increased the steam from 80 to 100 to 150, 160, and you drove it away to a sort of a normal speed at 160, and then you whacked it open as full as you liked after that, and away she went.
Here, Rodney Tizard shows how to get a West Country moving without a slip, helped by the big white-faced steam pressure gauge. The other main art form of the Bulleids was seeing where you were going, for the steam would lie lovingly across the casing and then flop down like a wet blanket across the driver's window. So they took their own bank of fog wherever they went.
We then had a West Country class, which is 34093, Saunton. And when we came away from London in a fog, it's strange, but although there was no wind, the steam When you went to London, it would be on the fireman's side. When you came back, it would go down over the driver's side. So I would fire out steadily, put 6 shovelfuls of coal on, look out for the next signal. And then I would call across to him, tell him the signal was off. He would not look across at me, but he would carry a cloth and he would give it a circular movement much as, to acknowledge my signal. Then we would go like that all the way down till we got to almost to Mitchell there, and there was one signal there that it was impossible for the fireman to see because it was a short signal and it was right over on the driver's side. And I would call out to him, we're approaching that signal, you'll have to find it. And he would then shut off steam and find it. And then he'd very often say to me, that is the first signal I've seen since we'd left Hampton Court Junction.
Stan Symes had both a brand new Merchant Navy and later a new West Country engine, so was able to explore their speedworthiness.
If you are really on the move, you can pull your lever up to about 15% with a Merchant Navy or West Country, and which is quite sufficient, and that engine will be at its best at that point. You can get the speed. A Merchant Navy or a West Country are quite capable of 90 miles an hour, even more if you wanted to, but that was always our maximum, 90 miles an hour, so officially we never exceeded it.
Unofficially, they'd top a ton. And for the men who rode in them in the south of England, this was the pinnacle of performance. An engine whose steam-raising ability was quite unparalleled, and whose crews achieved that rare thing, a perfect partnership between man and machine.
Well, steam and steam engines are an infinitely variable source of power, self-contained on a frame, which you whiz through the countryside in rather a dangerous manner. Boilers should be strapped down firmly to concrete pads and not placed on a rolling frame and hurtled through the night at 85 miles an hour. We stood on a small platform behind the boiler, threw the coal in on a footplate that was dancing and tossing under our feet. The driver was looking through a tiny window, mostly obscured by steam and smoke, catching the sight of signals, any one of which, if missed, would cause a major disaster. It was something that we grew up to. We didn't really appreciate the dangers, we didn't really appreciate the responsibility. We grew into it, and looking at it now as an older man, and having seen many, many mistakes made, I shudder sometimes at our temerity in doing it so light-heartedly. I remember being at the cinema and thinking, while watching Errol Flynn doing some crazy exploits, I'm going to be having more adventure than this when I go to work at midnight. It was extremely exciting. The contact with nature is very deep and a 24-hour contact. We see the sun rise, we see it fall, we see the stars above turning on the axis, we see the seasons come and go, and all the time this engine is running and chanting away around us. It's a very, very stimulating and spiritual sort of life.